I'm going to call on Professor Robert Mitzi, who is the Canada Research Chair in Queer Community and Diversity Education of the Faculty of Education, who is one of our sugar daddies for this event, who will say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks. I never thought I'd reach that status of sugar daddy already. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's guest speaker event, part of the 2S LGBTQ+ History Series. I bring greetings from the Faculty of Education. We are proud to co-sponsor this important event. We're honored to have Dr. Tom Hooper with us today. His talk today, Resisting Anti-Queer and Anti-Trans Hate, Lessons from 1970s Toronto, is incredibly timely and essential. As we face a rise in anti-2S LGBTQ+ hate, learning and teaching our history becomes even more critical. Dr. Hooper's significant contributions in the field of 2S LGBTQ+ history and his ongoing efforts to combat hate are exceptional. His work educates and inspires us to continue striving for equity and justice in our communities. I would like to draw your attention to the 2S LGBTQ history mural now located in our Faculty of Education. This mural supplements the knowledge shared in today's talk and serves as a constant reminder of the importance of understanding and honoring our diverse histories. So please visit the mural when you have an opportunity. Thank you for being here today and enjoy the presentation.
All right. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Tom Hooper, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Equity Studies at York University in Toronto, and a historian of Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ communities in Canada. Dr. Hooper's research has explored the February 5th, 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids, where over 300 men were arrested and criminally charged for their sexuality, with a particular focus on the community resistance to those raids, both in the streets and in the courts. Dr. Hooper has also examined the construction of dominant queer historical narratives, in particular the myth that legal changes in 1969 represented the decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada. Dr. Hooper has also investigated the use and misuse of heritage grants provided to Two-Spirit LGBTQ organizations, and I'll name names here, specifically Pride Toronto. So, Tom, please come and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for that, David. And should I wear the mic, or let me just see?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay, I will mic myself out. Just give me a second. Okay, how's this? Oh no, it's not on.
It's the same.
Okay, how's this? Okay, good. And I don't have to shout at you, so that's great.
That's not good.
Okay, maybe I can just set this here. Okay, and as sounds like a wire is loose or something.
All right.
Maybe if I just hold it. Maybe if I hold it. Okay, I'll just have to be more restrained with my arms than usual. So thank you, first of all, to Professor Churchill for inviting me here. Was really honored to get this invite and come back to Winnipeg. This is my second time here in total, and it's also my second time here this year. So I'm really honored to be here and to speak with you all about queer history and what is queer history, whose queer history, and what can we learn from it. And I think that when I look at what's happening in our communities today, as we see in particular anti-trans policies being passed by governments across this country, I'm reminded of the struggles that occurred in the 1970s. And I'm also reminded of a really important lesson that us historians are constantly dealing with, and that's that things don't always get better. Sometimes things get worse. And my concern, I think a lot of our concern in the days that we're living now, is that we're living in a time where things are getting worse. And the question that comes to us when this happens is, what do we do about it? What can we do? And I think as historians, it's our job to come up with some ideas. So that's what I've tried to do in this presentation. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was trying to think about queer history, the uses of queer history, and what are the things from my own work that can speak to the current situation that we find ourselves in today. So we've seen this rise, this resurgence of anti-queer and anti-trans hate in this country. The most widely talked about case is in Alberta, but Alberta is not the only province that's undertaking these efforts, for example, to forcibly out queer and trans kids in schools. These types of policies are incredibly dangerous. We know what the consequences of these policies are. They result in harm and indeed death within our communities. So this is a real threat. This is a dangerous threat. And one of the things that I want to make clear in this presentation is that this may very well be the tip of the iceberg. That when we look at what happened in the 1970s with the rise of the religious right and anti-queer hate, we see that the beginnings of that rise look very similar to what we're going through right now. And things got worse from then on out. So this kind of thing that we're talking about, this rise of anti-queer, anti-trans hate, is not new. We've seen it before. And I think in particular of what happened within our communities in the 1970s is particularly enlightening for us in our current times. So there's many reasons why we find ourselves in this current political situation. And I think one of the main reasons, one of the largest reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of the main reasons is that we are undergoing a forgetting of queer history. And that might seem strange because now we have Queer History Month and we have all of these queer organizations receiving millions and millions of dollars to produce queer history. And queer history is indeed being produced at an exceptional rate. But it begs the question of what kind of history is being produced and whose history is that for? Is it for us and our communities, or is it for someone else? So these are kind of some of the questions that I think come to my mind when I think about what can we learn from queer history, in particular the 1970s. Now, my project, as Professor Churchill explained, I'm actually not in the 70s. My project is about the 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids. It's one of the largest mass arrests in Canadian history. And it was this moment on February 5th of that year where over 200 police agents raided 4 gay bathhouses and arrested over 300 men in one night. This was the climax of what was taking place in the 1970s. This is the climax of this rise and this resurgence of anti-queer and anti-trans hate. So a lot of the work that I did in terms of this project was really trying to trace the origins of these raids. How do we get to this moment in time where hundreds of our community members are being rounded up by police in the middle of the night? And this story and this research that I'm going to talk to you about comes exactly from that research. It comes from me trying to investigate how did we get to this point here, and what did our community do about it. So this is kind of a convoluted infographic. Professor Churchill, you have my permission to distribute these slides to anybody who asks for them, if you want to take a look more in depth at some of these infographics. But this infographic is really about queer history and the themes that we find within current queer history. You can see here, this is a special edition $10 coin that was created by the Canadian Mint in 2019 to celebrate the so-called decriminalization of homosexuality in 1969. As a historian of the Toronto bathhouse raids, this mass criminalization event, I kind of question whether decriminalization ever took place in 1969. I'll get into that in a minute, but I just want to first talk about what is it that the production of queer history around this celebration, what does it actually do? What is it doing to our queer community histories? And it fosters this process of forgetting. And so the way this myth goes, the myth of 1969, it says that in 1969, Pierre Trudeau, he said there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. And from that point on, our communities were set on a path toward equality. This slow, steady march, starting in 1969, when our big gay god, Pierre Trudeau, handed us our rights to us from above. It took no struggle. It took no protest. It took no confrontation. All of that has been sucked out of the history. And in its place, we have put in this celebration. Let's celebrate. And so that's how we get to this point. It's just each step. We started in 1969 with decriminalization. We created our own organizations in the 70s. We got human rights protections in the 80s. We won important court battles in the 90s. And then we got gay marriage, which is the penultimate goal of this whole thing. Right. Yay. So this process of forgetting, in case you're into theory, I'm not really much into theory, but I had to throw some in here in case you really want it. That process of forgetting actually contributes to this notion that you'll hear queer historians reference, and that's homo-nationalism. This idea that queers are turning their backs on their communities and their community histories, and instead they're turning towards the state. They say the state is our friend. The state is the source of queer rights and queer liberation. And forgotten through that process are all these other things that are really central to us understanding our community's history and understanding queer history. So for example, we forget that in 1969, no laws were actually repealed. Queer sex remained defined in the criminal code as a criminal offense. We forget that criminalization drastically got worse after this so-called decriminalization, leading to things like the bathhouse raids. We forget about the rising tide of anti-queer and anti-trans hate that began around the middle of the 1970s and came to Canada. We forget about the gains that were achieved through struggles of resistance. And we also forget the really important connections to class, gender, anti-racist, and anti-colonial struggles that formed the basis of our resistance in both the 1970s and the 1980s. So that forgetting is a huge problem. And as we are embarking on this mission to produce queer history at an exponential level, this is a lesson we really need to take to heart. It's not just about producing more queer history. It matters what kind of queer history we are producing. So this is where 1969 bothers me, is it forgets the 70s. Like, we have this whole gap that gets completely removed from our collective memory by celebrating this idea that we achieved equality in 1969. And this is why I asked this question. How is it that you have over 300 men being arrested in 1981 if homosexuality had indeed been criminalized? And through that, that's how I, as Professor Churchill marked in his introduction for me, that's how I came to dismantle this myth of decriminalization in 1969. And so began my efforts to really try to reclaim and recapture a more radical version of queer history. So let's start talking about what was happening in the 1970s. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to note, global or at least transnational trends that were occurring. There was this rise starting about the late 1960s and really kicked into high gear in the 1970s of a more politicized religious right. Religious communities increasingly became politicized during this time and formed the basis of many movements, including the anti-queer and anti-trans movement, but also other things like the anti-choice movement as well, really kicked into high gear around this time. So we already have the expansion of a politicized religious right occurring during this time. And there were particular events that occurred in Canada and especially in Toronto that exacerbated that issue. So for example, in the summer of 1977, a 12-year-old Portuguese shoeshine boy, Emmanuel Jacques, was captured, kidnapped, held hostage, sexually assaulted, and eventually murdered in the roof of one of Yonge Street's body rub parlors. Body rub parlors, kind of like, it's not quite sex work, kind of sex work, kind of these enhanced massages, if you will. And so he was this 12-year-old boy was taken to one of these places and brutally attacked and murdered. And the growing politicized religious right really captured on this moment. There were groups who came out calling for the death penalty for homosexuals as a result of this thing. It also resulted in a massive police and municipal city government mobilization against Yonge Street and against perceived sex sin that was occurring there. They called Yonge Street Sin Strip. And so in the wake of this murder, especially because it occurred in a body rub parlor, police really set their sights on Yonge Street and they began cracking down. I should note that although this is about queer history, the very first group of people who were targeted in this campaign wasn't actually queers. It was sex workers. Sex workers were the very first victim of this cleanup campaign, even though sex workers had absolutely nothing to do with Jacques' murder. So this murder really ignited a really dark imagination for the city of Toronto. Many people bought into the homophobic rhetoric that was being pushed at that time. We were also influenced by what was happening in the United States. So earlier that year, before Jacques' murder, the government, the county in Miami-Dade passed an ordinance that would protect the rights of queer people, in particular those who were working as teachers in schools. And when this passed, it caught the attention of this growing religious right. And among them was Anita Bryant, pictured here. Anita Bryant was a beauty pageant contestant, and she was also a singer and a devoutly religious person. And she began this campaign in order to try to overturn that human rights ordinance in Miami-Dade. And in June of that year, she successfully led an effort to do so. The vote in Miami-Dade was almost 2-1 in favor of repealing rights for queer people. So inspired by this campaign in Miami-Dade to roll back on queer rights, Anita Bryant embarked on a cross-country tour, a cross-country campaign called Save Our Children. I should note, just kind of an interesting thing, I had a chance to go down to Florida and look through the Stonewall archives that are located down there. And I learned a lot about Anita Bryant through that. For example, she was almost sued because she chose the Save Our Children phrase. There was already a group called Save Our Children in the United States. It was actually an anti-choice group. And they threatened to sue Bryant, remarkably, even though they were completely in alignment. Anita Bryant was very much on the anti-choice campaign, but you know, the Save Our Children folks didn't want to give up their branding, so she had to abandon the Save Our Children idea eventually. But the key issue here was that the religious right was picking up on the fact that queer people and trans people were going to be working within public schools. They were going to be working with our children. And so schools and education have been a favorite target of the religious right. It was that way in the 70s, and it's that way today as well. Now, our community responded to these events. It responded by really trying to claim that homosexuality was not a threat to children, and some even took it to the next level, very controversially. Gerald Hannon, who was a photojournalist and author with The Body Politic, published this article. It wasn't his first article dealing with this issue, but certainly the timing of this was suspect. And this was really an article. It's called Men Loving Boys, Loving Men. And it was an essay that explored sexual and intimate relationships between men and young boys. As a result of this article, the Toronto police raided the offices of The Body Politic in December 1977, and it led to significant fractures within our community. So our community is being fractured and having really intense debates. Yeah, it's been with us forever. This is a normal, natural part of our communities. And it's something that we can't ignore. We have to sort through our differences. We have to reckon with our demons, but we also shouldn't get too concerned because we have been infighting since the beginning. Yet, I should note that our communities overcame those differences when it counted. And the resistance against Anita Bryant is a perfect example of that. So Bryant was invited to come to Canada by Toronto's religious right. This guy, Ken Campbell, who worked with Renaissance International, this is an evangelical organization, they helped organize what they called the Christian Liberation Crusade that would travel across Canada. They began in Toronto in January 1978. I should note, thanks to a wonderful conversation on the way from the airport last night with David, who reminded me very nicely that Toronto was not the only Canadian location. So a little quick editing on my slide last night. I added that, yes, Bryant came to Toronto in January 1978, but she also came back. She was in Peterborough, she was in Edmonton, and indeed right here in Winnipeg in April of that year. Then she came back again in September, where she went to London, Ontario. Our communities followed her where she went. Okay, our communities resisted her in Toronto. They resisted her in Edmonton. In fact, a whole bunch of queers from Calgary drove up to Edmonton to meet her and protest her. And similarly in London, the protest in London, Ontario at that time was one of the largest queer protests. Of course, we've now, thankfully, we have eclipsed that protest. But at the time, for 1978, it was quite remarkable in London, Ontario. So in terms of Toronto's response, I think it was quite remarkable what happened because they had to organize this hastily. The communities wanted to resist Anita Bryant's visit. They wanted to be felt, seen, and heard in the streets while she was here. So they held several protests. On the first night, they did a downtown protest where they marched through the streets of downtown. And then on the second night, they actually took the subway up to North York to the church where Bryant was speaking to protest outside of the church. This was a remarkable protest for many reasons, but one of the most important reasons was the coming together of queers, trans people, and lesbians. Lesbian solidarity was quite on display through this protest. And the lesbians, they viewed Bryant as a double threat. You know, they viewed her as a threat because they were queer and they understood that the rollback of queer rights would affect lesbians, but they also were in favor of choice and reproductive choice. And they see this religious right campaigner, Save Our Children, and they thought this is a huge threat. We need to join up with our queer family and we need to go confront this threat. It's important to note that there were huge divisions at this time. The Body Politic was just raided over an article talking about and glamorizing sex with children. The lesbians were not on board with that. And there were problems all through the 70s between queers and lesbians, in particular over this idea of age of consent and laws related to family. So there were these really intense divisions. national queer conferences that were, being undermined as a result of these divisions, they were put aside for these 2 days to come out into the streets and resist together. I think that's really an important process. And by no means am I arguing that we just excuse differences or excuse casual sexism and misogyny, which is exactly what was going on in the 70s within gay communities especially. I'm not saying we forget that or forgive it. But in this moment, there was a greater political threat at stake. And our communities came together to confront that threat. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn. I also would just want to talk about some other hate that was kind of stirred up as a result of both the Emmanuel Jacques murder, the Men Loving Boys article, and by Anita Bryant. And that was Halloween. So in a few weeks, we're coming up on Halloween, and it's a really important queer holiday. It's, aside from Pride, if you want to call that important, it's a really important queer holiday. And in Toronto and other major urban centers across North America and elsewhere, Halloween brought queers out, and in really public ways. So in Toronto, going back to before 1949, there were these drag balls that were hosted at various locations in the city. So drag queens, trans people would come up fully dressed, decked out, and they would hold pageants and contests. They would parade along the streets. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was held at Letro's Nile Room down on King Street, so nowhere even near where we think of today's Contemporary Village. And in the 1960s, it moved to this bar on Yonge Street called the St. Charles Tavern. Now, initially, the Halloween festival, the Halloween drag balls, was this wonderful spectacle. It brought people out into the streets. It brought the straight community out into the streets, not to hate. They came out because they thought it was fun. They thought it was cool, just like a lot of the same reasons why straight people show up to Pride today. And so it was a really fun time. It was really a particular moment where our community could kind of shake off the shackles of living within the closet. But increasingly through the 70s, coinciding with this rise of the religious right and the rise of anti-queer and trans hate, Halloween changed. In the early 1970s, there was a story of a young queer person who was assaulted on Halloween night and duct taped to a light pole, and was rescued later by police. And this increasingly became a problem. By the time we get to 1978, and especially 1979, the Halloween balls and the pageants that would celebrate this became hate fests. So hundreds and even thousands of heterosexual homophobes would show up to the St. Charles Tavern to gawk and to harass and to intimidate the queers who were on pageant. They even brought with them cartons of eggs. And you can see in this photograph here, taken by Gerald Hannon, it may be hard to see on the screen, but there's a whole bunch of eggshells on the ground, and these drag queens are pelted with eggs. And let me tell you, if you're a drag queen, you spend all day putting your face on, getting pelted with an egg is totally not acceptable. Like, that is such a violation of the art and the time and effort that these queens put into this fest. So the hate fest was a huge problem, and it was inspired by this rising tide of anti-queer and anti-trans hate. And our community had to fight back. No one else was going to protect us. The police stood by. The police are just out of camera shot here, and they have their backs pointed toward the crowd. They're not looking at the homophobes. They're looking at the drag queens, and in many cases making jokes as they're getting pelted by eggs. So one of the really important lessons that we have to learn from resisting the 1970s anti-queer and anti-trans hate is that no one else is going to protect our communities. It's going to require us. It's going to require our communities to fight this battle. There really is a call to action in our present moment here. We can't sit by and expect some benevolent government is going to come along and fix this. It won't happen unless we demand it and if we take it in the streets. So the cleanup of the Sin Strip, as after the rise of anti-queer hate after the Emmanuel Jacques murder, it was largely complete by the time we get to Halloween of 1979. But now the police had a new target. Now that the sex workers had been cleared out of Yonge Street, they turned their attention north to where the gay community was, to where the St. Charles Tavern was, where the Parkside Tavern was. They established, at the Parkside in particular, the police established a surveillance system in the washroom. They hid behind a ventilation grate, and for hours at a time would sit in this tiny room peering at people using the washroom to see if they were going to engage in queer sex. I talked to one of the cops who did that. Let me tell you, it's not a fun shift. Not fun. The ventilation grate is where all the smells go. So that's kind of the silver lining in this story. Yes, all the harm and all the people arrested, but there were 2 cops had to sit through smelling people's shit all day. And that kind of makes me happy. Okay, so this type of entrapment and surveillance was kicking into high gear, right? Police were entrapping men in washrooms and arresting them with criminal offenses for engaging in gay sex. So again, this criminalization harassment was taken up by the police during this time of rising anti-queer and anti-trans hate. And as a result of this increasing surveillance, the police turned their attention to the bathhouses. And on December 9th, 1978, police raided the Barracks bathhouse. This was compared to February 1981, a small scale raid. There were 28 men who were arrested during this raid. But it was a warning sign to our community that this problem, this escalation of anti-queer and anti-trans hate, it wasn't getting better. It was actually getting worse. A few months later, the Toronto Police Association newsletter, News and Views, published a series of articles in the March 1979 edition of the magazine. In a column called Pensioners News, a retired police officer, Ken Peglar, published this racist diatribe complaining about a lack of WASPs in Toronto, targeted the queer community, targeted the Black community, the Jewish community, Italian community, and South Asian people. Those were the particular targets of the Pensioners News article. There was another article called The Homosexual Fact by a staff sergeant named Tom Mulclair. And this was an article that was this diatribe expressing disgust at the increasing visibility and the perceived increasing acceptance of Toronto's queer communities. So these were highly offensive articles to various communities across the city. And this brought these communities together, which is such a key lesson for us to learn. Queers have to take up this battle, but we ought not to take up the battle on our own. That there are a variety of communities that will come together with us under a common threat to fight back against this. And that's exactly what happened in 1979. After the publication of these articles that really lumped together Black, Indigenous, racialized, and queer people, we also came together. Our communities came together and formed a group called the Working Group on Police Minority Relations. One of the most prominent members of this group was Bromley Armstrong. He was the spokesperson. He was a founding member of the Jamaican Canadians Association who had really fought for decades for civil rights for Black and racialized people in the city. He's also served as one of the first commissioners of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Also in this group is Charlie Roach, a very well-known civil rights lawyer at the time, and a variety of groups co-signed to this working group. It included the Native Canadian Center, so Indigenous folks were part of this struggle. They came to the defense of queers. They joined the resistance for the queer community in Toronto. The Arab Palestinian Organization. So when we look at what's happening in the world today, and we wonder about, solidarities and what's happening in Palestine have to do with queers, I think a lot of those arguments have been made, so I won't rehash them. But historically, in Toronto, the Arab Palestinian Organization came to the defense of queers in this really important time of need. The International Women's Day Committee, the Lesbian Organization of Toronto. So the lesbians are here time and time again. They never go away. They're always standing in solidarity with queers and showing up at the right times. And also the group that was responsible for resisting the bathhouse raids, the Right to Privacy Committee. You can see pictured here is Bromley Armstrong, and next to him, Reverend Brent Hawkes, who was working with the Right to Privacy Committee at that time. Brent Hawkes is a really well-known queer activist, and speaking of gay marriage, was one of the first to perform gay marriage when it became legal in 2003. So these connections, this groundwork that had occurred through the 70s was really important when we get to 1981. So by the time we have this mass arrest, over 300 men arrested in one night, our community was able to respond. So the next night, February 6, 1981, thousands of people take to the streets, march down Yonge Street. They march over to 52 Division, the police station responsible for the raids. They scream, "Fuck you, 52." And then they storm up University Avenue to the doors of Queen's Park. And some of the protest marshals that I interviewed said, who were at the back of the crowd, said as they got to Queen's Park, they could see the two front doors going in and out. The mob was about to break through the door. It could have been our very own queer January the 6th. And that would have been amazing. Very different from the actual January 6th. Very different character of the mob, but it would have been really interesting had queers breached those doors. And I wonder how gay we would have made Queen's Park. We also went back to the streets. It wasn't just one protest. It was sustained protest that led to the success of our community successfully resisting these raids. So there was another protest February 20th. And a series of more protests that occurred through 81, which is a different election for a different time. But I just want to make the point that one and done has never achieved anything in our community. The Anita Bryant protest, there were two protests, two different nights. The bath raids protests, there were two huge protests in February, and then more in June, in September, and then October. So sustained street action is a big key to a lesson to be learned here from the 1970s. But back to this idea of building coalitions and working with other marginalized and oppressed groups. So at this February 20th protest, where thousands of queers took to the streets to resist the bathhouse raids, Lamona Johnson was one of the featured speakers. Lamona Johnson was the widow of a man named Albert Johnson, who was murdered by Toronto police in the summer of 1979. And in the wake of Albert Johnson's murder, Lamona Johnson became one of the city's most well-known civil rights spokespeople. Her and Bromley Armstrong, Charlie Roach, they were very active in demanding justice for Albert Johnson. And they gained this profile to the point where 2 years later, once we get to the bathhouse raids protest, Lamona Johnson used her platform, took a huge risk by utilizing her platform to come to the defense of men who were having sex in bathhouses. And she took this platform and she stood in solidarity with queers. She said, "Together, we have a duty, you and I, and all of us must coordinate our efforts, abilities, and strength to destroy all forms of discrimination in our society. So these types of solidarities, these types of coalitions, these are key to our ability to successfully resist anti-queer and anti-trans hate. So just to wrap it up, I think I'm about out of time. What can we learn from this? I've made all of these points already, so this is kind of just to reinforce them. But, really, to fight back in the present day, we have to engage in sustained direct action. We have to take to the streets. But the streets aren't it. Taking to the streets and protests are great. It's fun. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of risk. But it's not the only thing. It's not in and of itself, it will not accomplish the task at hand. We have to embark on a multi-pronged approach to resist this rising hate. We have to be willing to work across, but not forget, divides within our communities. This is going to involve working in active coalitions with various groups. And this especially involves Black, Indigenous, racialized, disabled people, and those working within the labor movement. These are the keys to how we were successfully able to resist in the 1970s and 1980s. I have this photo here. This is of Gary Kinsman is here on the right. He's a very well-known queer historian and activist. And at this event, this was in 1979 at a protest called the Coalition for Life Together. This was a group of queers and disabled people who were calling on the Ontario government to add both disability and sexual orientation to the Ontario Human Rights Code. And neither group was willing to go along with adding their group without adding the others. So the disabled community said, you're not going to add disabled to the Ontario Human Rights Code without adding sexual orientation. We stand in solidarity with the queers. And that's exactly what happened. This is one of the key protests where that took place. But at the same time, I want to be careful here not to romanticize this. The 70s was a very messy time for activism. There were a lot of problems. Misogyny, racism, ageism, ableism, colonialism, all of these were prevalent. They weren't just present, they were prevalent parts of queer communities of resistance. The guys, especially the guys, the white guys in these movements had a lot of problems looking back. And I think in so many respects, this hindered our ability to successfully resist. So we have to acknowledge that this is not, I'm not giving you a romantic history of the 70s. Oh, look how great we were. There were a lot of problems. And it, as I said, might actually explain why things got worse before they got better. So we still have things that we need to work through and resolve. But for this particular moment, I think we have to set those aside and really fight the battle at hand. So just getting back to the importance of queer history, I think we have to be really critical of this idea, especially in a queer history month. Whose queer history? And are we talking about a history from above, or are we talking about a history from below? And so much of our queer histories that have been produced lately, they come from this celebration model. Yay, 1969. Yay, gay marriage. All of these things. We really need to abandon the celebration narrative. I'm not against celebration, and I think we need to acknowledge the gains, but to dwell on it, to create huge campaigns about it, it's devoid of any connection to our real community's histories. And this is why we have seen when some queer organizations embark on a top-down version of queer history, they run into some trouble. They engage in some fraud and some forgery and some misappropriation of funds to the tune that a group like Pride Toronto has to pay back over $500,000 to the federal government because of their shenanigans. So we have to hold queer organizations accountable for their misuse of queer history and instead develop a focus in our history, remembering our community's actions of resistance. I just want to say thank you to my really good friend, David Churchill. I'll just say, David Churchill has been a mentor for me for, well, since 2011 at least. We met, I think, at that conference, if not before. And Professor Churchill said to me, hey, you know, you should think about publishing in the Journal of Canadian Studies. I'm this co-editor. We're going to be putting this thing together. You should do that. That's just one example of the so many ways in which David Churchill has mentored so many queer historians. So if we're going to celebrate queer history, we have to celebrate this guy here today. So I will leave it there. Thank you to the University of Manitoba, all of the sponsors. I won't run through the list. And to all of you for coming. If you have any questions, you want to keep in touch, I've put my email up there on the screen.
So we have time for questions.